Hello everyone, today I'm bringing you a scary story with a creepy Soviet vibe straight off the Russian creepypasta forums. Before we start, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel. Also, after you watch, be sure to let me know down in the comments if you enjoyed the story. Let's get into it. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Now that a lot of time has passed after the state has vanished along with many of the people who were aware of what happened, I can tell you about the events I experienced in the cold tundra in the winter of 1949. For the entire following year, I was hauled from one place to another, interrogated, I would tell my story. Then they'd ask again, listen, take me somewhere else, and so on in a loop. After which I was simply locked up in prison for life as a traitor to the motherland, and even there, I filled out so many papers and signed my name so many times that the fear of the consequences of speaking out haunts me to this day, even though I know everyone forgot about my existence long ago. And even if they haven't, I'm already in my 60s, I have no family left, meaning I have nothing left to fear. I was supposed to kick the bucket on a prison bunk, but by a stroke of luck, literally 4 months later, somehow I ended up on an amnesty list, and now the only thing I must do is tell you my story. But first things first. I perfectly understand that my story is hard to believe, but all these events actually happened. It took place back when the active development of the north of the now collapsed state, the USSR, was in full swing. I was one of the few who, of my own free will in the post-war era, joined geological groups to explore the riches of the Putarana Plateau. After graduating from the institute, I was offered a job. For 6 or 7 months straight, I was to work in the tundra, far in the north of our country. Then I was entitled to 2 months of rest. The money offered was quite good, even for those times. Unlike my classmates, I hadn't managed to start a family, so nothing held me back, and I agreed without much hesitation. The job wasn't too demanding. I had trained as a mechanic and even managed to get some work experience. My main duties involved flying with geological groups to various points where I had to maintain the equipment, mostly the generators. Every geological station had on average 1 generator for power. Without electricity, believe me, things get extremely shitty for geologists. And it's not even about basic comforts. In winter, the temperature stays around -40 degrees Fahrenheit. And wind gusts often reach 45 to 65 miles per hour. You simply can't survive without heat. In the summer, it's easier. If something goes wrong, going a day or two without electricity sucks. Sure, but it's tolerable. But in the winter, which by the way lasts for almost 9 months here, you're completely screwed. We didn't have a backup. Every pound counts when you're delivering cargo to a site by helicopter, and a generator is a hulking beast the size of a train car. But during my brief time working with it, there were no serious problems. Just do the maintenance on time, check the oil, and listen to make sure nothing is knocking. Sure, a couple of times I had to take it apart, freezing my snot at 40 below, and fix it using whatever makeshift tools we had. Once they had to send people to the mainland for spare parts. Condensation caused a hydrostatic lock, bending a connecting rod. We waited 4 weeks. There was no faster way, but thankfully, that was during the summer. Overall, things were pretty boring. I entertained myself however I could, and it was just that kind of time. I remember once a new geologist flew in, a young guy, even younger than I was back then. He started asking everyone, under various pretexts, which rivers had gold in them. He'd casually ask one guy, then another. Well, when he asked me, I told him about a certain river about 10 miles from the camp. I said I'd been fishing there and saw something shiny on the bottom but couldn't be sure. I told him to take a sack, gather some dirt, and bring it back to camp where we'd secretly sift it and see if there was anything there. The fool actually believed me. He trekked all the way to the river, lugging a sack of dirt across the entire tundra, and out of sheer greed he hauled back a massive amount. He brought it back and started sifting. Well, I admit I went a bit far here. I secretly sprinkled some copper shavings into his dirt. When he spotted the shiny bits, his eyes bulged out like saucers. He was so ecstatic. And then he vanished for 3 days. Just as we were about to organize a search party, I confessed to the prank. We followed the river and found him. He had spent all 3 days searching for gold in the river, except he hadn't found anything and didn't want to return empty-handed. He never spoke to me again, and eventually he flew out for good. Nobody forced me to sit in one place around the clock, so while the geologist went about their business, I had another hobby. I would drive across the tundra looking for lakes with good fishing. There was plenty of fish there. Naturally, since for over 60 miles there wasn't a single living soul, just dwarf trees and small mountains. After clearing it with management, I would leave for 2 or 3 days, making sure to take some food, matches, a rifle. I had absolutely no desire to run into a bear or a wolverine without one. A compass, a tent, a sleeping bag, a small folding auger, and, of course, fishing rods with a set of jigs. I'd load all this into a snowmobile and head out. The main danger in the tundra for first-timers is the illusion that it's practically impossible to get lost. The high mountains are visible from afar, the low trees don't obstruct the view, and landmarks can be seen miles away. But that's total bullshit. It's just endless fields of dwarf trees and identical mountain ranges. And that's it. You can wander endlessly searching for the place you came from. People manage to get lost in the most mundane situations. One summer, 2 avid fishermen rowed out to the middle of a lake. They fished and there were 4 mountains around the lake, identical ones. They rowed to one shore, looked around. This wasn't where they came from. They rowed to another shore. Bam! Not from here either. The lake wasn't even that big, so they started rowing along the shoreline, looking for tracks. Good thing it was summer during the polar day, with the sun shining almost 24 hours. Still, after about 6, maybe 7 hours, the exhausted friends finally found the spot where they had inflated their boat, and it was by pure chance. Before getting into the boat, one of the fishermen had crumpled up an empty pack of cigarettes and tossed it on the shore. That's how they found the right spot. Otherwise, who knows how long they would have wandered. Everything is so identical and endless. It simply blows your mind. Sometimes, when you're driving in a straight line, you start feeling like you've seen all this before and are just driving in circles. A stupid sense of déjà vu. The main rule here is under no circumstances should you veer off your path. And so that time, having loaded my modest set of essentials onto the snowmobile and leaving the geological camp behind, I sped off into the tundra in search of a good fishing lake. According to my calculations, the spot where I wanted to fish should have harbored some nicely sized pike. I really wanted to surprise my colleagues with a grand catch. Literally a few hours later, I was approaching that fateful lake, which I subsequently pointed out to hundreds of people. Military men of various ranks, and scientists. But that time, I was seeing it for the first time. I can't say it looked any different from the hundreds of other lakes scattered across the tundra, so everything that happened next was nothing more than cruel fate. I've often returned to this moment in my thoughts over all those long years spent in prison. Why me? What are the odds that in a godforsaken place, among hundreds of identical lakes, a single person would find exactly this one? But I digress. At that time of year, the lakes froze down to a depth of at least 3 feet, so I fearlessly drove my snowmobile practically to the middle. And then the ice cracked. The snowmobile instantly plunged into a fissure, taking me with it. Internally, I braced myself to swim up through the freezing water, but instead, I felt myself falling into the void. Before hitting the ice and losing consciousness, I realized only one thing. There was no water under the ice. In fact, it wasn't a lake at all, but an ice cap hanging like a bubble over some kind of cave. I don't know how long I lay unconscious, but judging by the fact that I hadn't managed to get frostbite anywhere, I must have woken up almost immediately. The cave I found myself in was about 20 to 25 feet deep, and the frozen water I had mistaken for a lake formed a sort of thin, icy roof through which a faint light managed to penetrate. First of all, I looked around and, despite being raised by atheist parents, crossed myself. Right next to where I had fallen was an even deeper chasm, into which my snowmobile and all my gear had apparently plummeted. Without getting up, I carefully crawled away from the edge, after which I began to think about what to do next. The situation was far from ideal. Without a weapon or a means of transportation, even if I managed to get out of this cave, the chances of making it back to camp were incredibly slim. I checked my pockets. The matches, tucked into my jacket and sloppily wrapped in a moisture-resistant cloth, were still there. The flask of pure alcohol I had carefully placed in my inner jacket pocket the day before hadn't gone anywhere either. Well, that was something. Tearing off a piece of cloth, wrapping it around a stick I found near my fall site, and dousing the rag in alcohol, I made a makeshift light source. Once I lit this improvised torch, fully armed, I set off to explore the place I had ended up in. The entire floor of the cave was covered in a layer of peculiar debris. Branches, driftwood, small stones, and frost-covered remnants of vegetation that hadn't rotted due to the permafrost, all indicated that there used to be water here, and that this place really had been a lake. The ice crust I fell through must have formed right at that moment, meaning there was water in the lake during the summer, but in the winter, after the cap froze over, it drained away somewhere. Perhaps the water seeped into the same fissure my snowmobile had fallen into. This was all highly bizarre to say the least. The Putarana Plateau is monolithic, and the nearest tectonic plate boundaries, which could cause an earthquake or another cataclysm capable of such rock collapses, were so far away that it was easier to believe in mythical giants or massive mammoths caving in the hollows beneath the lake than to think this happened naturally. Puzzled, I went on exploring the cave. I tried to step carefully. A random sprained ankle from an awkward slip on the slick rocks would be enough to trap me in this place forever. However, I didn't forget that I needed to get out as fast as possible, as the risk of freezing to death here underground was much higher than on the surface. Some time passed, maybe 2 hours, maybe 3. The situation was increasingly starting to feel hopeless. On the section of the lake bed where I found myself, there was no way to climb to the surface. On one side was the collapse, on the other, an almost vertical cliff face. Either way, I was trapped. I inspected the cliff, looking for a place to climb up, though I didn't know what I would do even if I found one. After all, there was a thick layer of ice up there, and breaking through it without falling off the sheer drop and without bringing tons of frozen water down on myself was practically impossible, even theoretically. However, at one point, I found a small, narrow crevice, and by a miracle the flame of my torch flickered when I held it up to this hole. That meant there could be a way up somewhere, in there. Until that moment, I didn't even know there was such a word as claustrophobia. I wasn't educated in those fancy bourgeois terms back then, yet I remember those sensations with sheer horror. I crawled. The passage kept getting narrower and narrower. Sharp rocks snagged my clothes, scratching my arms, tearing pieces of fabric, and pressing down on me with all their mass. No light reached here anymore, and the only thing I prayed to all the gods for was that my already weak torch flame wouldn't go out right there, leaving me alone with the impenetrable darkness in this hellish black hole. I don't know how much time passed, but at some point, exhausted, I literally tumbled into a space so wide that the fire from my torch couldn't illuminate any walls or ceiling out of the gloom. Just darkness all around, and me, lonely and tired, in the middle of it. My heart was pounding wildly, blood hammering in my temples. I was glad I made it out of that crevice alive, but at the same time I was terrified. I had no idea what lay ahead. Thoughts tripped over one another in my head. I didn't know if I was making the right choice. Maybe by going deeper into the cave I was only condemning myself to certain death. Maybe I should have stayed put and waited for the moment they realized I was missing, found me, and saved me. They did notice the geologist was missing and found him after all. Yes, holding out for 3 days would be hard, but still doable. When you have fire and ice, you can survive on just water for at least a week. But I absolutely did not want to go back. The prospect of crawling back through that damn hole appealed to me so little that I was more inclined to die than scramble back. With that thought, I eagerly began exploring the room I was in. I walked along the wall, lighting the way ahead with my torch. Literally a few minutes later, I stumbled upon it. I didn't immediately grasp what I was looking at, and only a few minutes later, along with a wave of dread, my mind began to process what I had found. The skeleton of a creature lay against the wall. At first, it looked like the remains of some large beast, like a deer, but upon examining it closer, I started to feel a sticky sweat breaking out all over me. The creature's head definitely had canine features. Despite the permafrost, the tissues were damaged as if the creature had burned alive. The fact that it had been dead for a long time was indisputable. The right side of its body had practically grown into the ice covering the cave walls. The creature's body had humanoid features and its limbs had 6 digits each. The creature was about 8 feet tall, and it was wearing clothes. Scraps of fabric faded by time covered the creature's body. In life, it had worn something resembling a skirt and some sort of cape over its body. There was an ornament around the creature's neck. I hesitated for a long time to touch the corpse, but my curiosity finally won out. I carefully removed the ornament from the frozen body and examined it. There were patterns on it, looking like writing, etched around the image of a 7-limbed beast. At that moment, I experienced the most mixed feelings of my life. There was fear, pride, and curiosity. Naturally, I was holding proof that there is, or was, an uncharted race on our planet. It was a massive scientific breakthrough, and it wasn't just anyone who made it, but me. This was worth an order and all Union glory at the very least. Just as I wanted to take a closer look at the corpse of this incomprehensible creature, my thoughts were interrupted by a low hum. It came from far away, and in that second I couldn't be absolutely certain I hadn't imagined it, because before that, having been in the complete silence of the cave for a long time, the only things I could hear were the echo of my footsteps and my own heartbeat in my ears. Inspired by my discovery, I was already imagining this cave being named in my honor, or maybe even a street. Then I made the biggest mistake of my life. I walked toward where I thought the sound was coming from. With every step I took, I became more and more convinced that the sound, resembling beating drums, was not a trick of my imagination. I followed the sound, and then, flaring up one last time, my torch died. At first, I was terrified, but after standing in complete darkness for a few minutes, I saw a faint glimmer of light deep within the cave. My first thought was that this was it, the exit, finally. But as I carefully made my way closer to the light source, trying not to trip, it became clear that what I was seeing had nothing to do with daylight. What's more, the sound of beating drums grew louder the closer I got to that little light. Everything that followed is permanently seared into my memory. As soon as I approached the light source, I realized I was on a precipice, affording a clear view of what was happening on a small cavern floor about 15 feet below me. This area was illuminated by a bonfire which, for some reason, burned with a blue flame. Dancing around it like shadows were silhouettes. I recognized them as the creatures, a corpse of which I had seen earlier. The drumming seemed to intensify, though no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't spot the source of the sound. At that moment, I should have left, run away, hidden as far from this place as possible, but fear yielded to curiosity, and I peered at the silhouettes of the incomprehensible beings, which writhed unnaturally in the blue light of this unearthly fire. They would shake as if in a sickly fit, then freeze, raising their impossibly long paws or arms, God knows what they had, upward. They bared their fangs, ran on all fours, fell, and got back up. Soon, I saw what I hadn't been able to make out in the darkness earlier. They were situated near a massive sinkhole, similar to the one my snowmobile had fallen into, only much larger. It started right next to the fire and stretched so far that I couldn't see its end or edge. I watched all this as if spellbound. I couldn't move, couldn't even take a breath, and then, suddenly, the figures froze. The beating of the drums stopped. The figures began to whimper and growl. It didn't sound like a dog's or wolf's snarl. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. At some point, I began to distinguish words. They were saying something like, "Krr, krr, kahal, kahal," over and over again. The echo repeated after them, carrying a wild rumble throughout the entire cave. "Krr, krr, kahal, kahal, krr, krr, kahal, kahal." The horrifying rasping seemed to sound so loud that I couldn't even hear my own thoughts. And then happened the thing that still haunts my nightmares. Abruptly, as if by the wave of an unseen conductor's baton, the creatures fell silent. For a second, the silence rang in my ears. From somewhere inside that sinkhole the creatures were standing next to came a terrifying, unearthly hum, as if someone blew into a massive, inhumanly large horn. and then it emerged from the sinkhole. The firelight was far too dim to make out its features. It was so massive that, even without seeing it fully, I physically felt this thing crawling out from absolutely everywhere. I don't know what kind of creature it was, but at that moment something snapped in my head, and I screamed. The creatures down below instantly whipped their heads toward me. I just felt dozens of gazes burning through me, and after that, I bolted. Into the darkness somewhere, blind as a puppy, not thinking about the fact that I could trip and fall, not understanding, fundamentally, which way I was supposed to go. My only goal was to run away from it. That creature. That had lurked God knows how long at the bottom of the cave. I ran, fell, got up. I heard the sounds of footsteps behind me. I heard the wheezes and howls of those creatures. Tears were streaming down my face. Everything that happened next stayed in my memory in fragments, as if I were dead drunk. I remember seeing light. I remember running towards it, stumbling, feeling no pain, with only one desire: to get as far away from that cave, from that place, as possible. I remember clawing at the ice with my bare hands, bounding up an almost sheer cliff in literally a few leaps, like some daring athlete. Once out, I ran wherever my legs would carry me, without stopping for a single second. I spent that night almost completely sleepless, keeping warm by a fire, hearing the footsteps of my pursuers in every rustle. And when they finally found me a few days later, for a long time afterward, I had an absolute panic-inducing fear of dogs. You already know what happened next. I would, of course, prefer it if all this were just some stupid figment of my imagination, but that ornament I grabbed from the cave, even though they took it away from me almost immediately, convinced me anyway that everything I saw was real. After that, they took me to that spot several times. A whole bunch of military personnel crawled all over those caves, exploring them from top to bottom, and God is my witness, I have no idea what they found down there. Maybe we'll never know, but now at least I've done what I wanted. I've told my story, a story that nobody was ever supposed to know. To this day, I still wonder who I encountered in that cave that day. Millions of square miles of Earth, boundless earthly expanses where even now, in the era of space exploration, no human foot has stepped. Hundreds of such caves hidden from human eyes. We fear aliens and want to find intelligent life on other planets, while God only knows what secrets our very own native planet is hiding from us in its depths. So, that's the story, guys. What did you think? Let me know what you liked and what you didn't. Make sure to drop a comment with your thoughts on the story and the video overall. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, be sure to check out my other videos. Catch you in the next one. Bye.